well, good morning, everyone. Mercy, Dan, come on over. Don't be shy. Mercy just whispered to Dan and I that she wanted to do a dance party right now. So we can do that. That's in the Psalms. It's in the Bible. Hey, so if you were here last week, we had Carrie Larned up here to just give a little personal story about how God has been using this series and really just the command, the invitation from Jesus to literally love our neighbor. And so she shared about that they were having a Memorial Day party, and they did. They had 19 neighbors come, and it was awesome. So that's just great. And then this morning, we're going to hear from Mercy Mulder and Dan Driscoll. And they're just going to share kind of what their life group is doing and how God has been using this series for them. So take it away.
All right. So my husband and I and my boys and my parents, we live in Ontario Ranch, and our small group's going to be joining us because we live in one of those neighborhoods where no one goes outside. So we have to be creative, and how are we going to reach our neighbors? Well, I think ice cream is a really good way to kind of make people come outside and just get to know each other. So I'm going to create a flyer, about 20 houses and see who comes and let the Lord work there, and our small group's going to be there to support. I just think of a row of dominoes, and I think, that first one, you need that inertia to get it going. So really excited to be that domino. So let's see what God gets to do in our community by this event that we're going to be hosting. So.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because our life group has been meeting, and we've been discussing the art of neighboring. And after a couple of weeks, we kind of, I think, ran out of excuses for why not to reach out to our neighbors. So we kind of decided to, plan some things. So rather than each of us meeting kind of, doing their own thing in their own neighborhood, we decided to, we have a built-in party in our life group. So we're planning the ice cream social, and then we have another one coming up in July where we're going to go to Zach and Kendra, who also are in our life group. We're going to go and do a block party in their neighborhood, and we're just going to see what God does. But I think that's the way to get started, is just to get out there, we've run out of excuses, just do it, basically. So that's it.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Let's give them a round of applause. You take it. So this sounds like this is the party life group. Ice cream social, 4th of July block party. Mercy, I've seen Mercy and her husband dance. You guys are dancers, so that's cool. Thank you guys for sharing. The whole point of that, guys, is we want to put this into action. Like, we don't want to be a church that's kind of doing the Sunday thing, and then Monday through Saturday we just get back to normal. We want this to be the new normal. And so I hope that you're challenged as well as encouraged just by Dan and Mercy and their life group, as well as what Carrie and their life group shared last Sunday as well. Let me start us off this morning with, there's an author named Leonard Sweet. He has a book called From Tablet to Table. And he shares these thoughts and statistics. He writes this: an untabled faith is an unstable faith. A neglect of the table in our churches is echoed in our families and communities. And now he's just going to list off a bunch of statistics. These are very interesting. We eat 1 in every 5 meals in our car. 1 in 4 of us eat at least one fast food meal every single day. Who here is brave enough to raise their hand and admit that they have fast food every single day? Man, the hands are just a little, you guys are like halfway up. Oh, there's a big hand back there. Okay, it's a safe place. U.S. households spend roughly the same amount per week on fast food as they do groceries. Here, check this one out. 60 years ago, the average dinner time was 90 minutes. Today, it is less than 12 minutes. And that's when we eat together, which is less and less frequently. The majority of U.S. families report eating a single meal together less than 5 days a week. And even then, most of our dinners are in front of the TV. No wonder the average parent spends only 38 minutes per week in meaningful conversation with their children. And so he says, hey, we are losing the table. And I think the bigger insight is that he says our culture is hungry for table time. He goes on, the loss of the table has had quantifiable negative effects both physically and psychologically on our families and our kids. And a couple more round of statistics. The number one factor for parents raising kids who are drug-free, healthy, intelligent, kind human beings, frequent family dinners. The number one shaper of vocabulary in younger children, even more than any other family event, including playtime, frequent family dinners. The number one predictor of future academic success for elementary age children, frequent family dinners. One of the best safeguards against childhood obesity, frequent family dinners. Two more. The best prescription to prevent eating disorders among adolescent girls, frequent family dinners. The variable most associated with lower incident of depressive and suicidal thoughts among 11 to 18-year-olds. Okay. He concludes it with this. If you want kids with fewer emotional and behavioral problems, great emotional well-being, more trusting and helpful behaviors towards others, and high life satisfaction, then you need frequent family dinners. And he ends with this. There's a reason why Jesus made eating a sacrament. So 3 things this morning. Food, Jesus, and then the series this morning that we are entering, The Art of Neighboring. What is the connection between these things, food, Jesus, and loving your neighbor? Tim Chester is a pastor in the UK. He asked this question. In the Bible, there's a phrase, the Son of Man came, and he says, fill in the blank. So, the Son of Man came, ... If you don't know, the phrase, the Son of Man, in the first century was this kind of ancient Jewish technical phrase that referred to when the Messiah would come to rule over the nations and rescue the world. And so for us as Christians, we believe that Jesus was and is that Messiah. And so for us, we can say, okay, Jesus came, ... Jesus came, you fill in the blank. There are 3 ways that phrase is answered in the New Testament. I'm going to go over them. The first 2 are in the same category. We'll put this up on the screens. So the book of Mark, which we all know is by far the best book in the Bible, chapter 10, verse 45 says this. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Luke chapter 19, verse 10 puts it this way. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. So let's stop right there. Those 2 phrases, the Son of Man came, the New Testament biographers answer it for us in 2 ways. Both ways are a statement of purpose, meaning they answer why Jesus came. Why did Jesus come? He came to serve, he came to give his life as a ransom, and then he came to seek and to save the lost. That is why Jesus came, according to the New Testament. Those are both statements of purpose. Here's the third one. It doesn't ask why Jesus came. The third one that we read tells us how he came. It gives us the method by which Jesus came. Here it is, Luke chapter 7, verse 34. The Son of Man came by eating and drinking. And you say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So did Jesus, we know why he came. He came to seek and save the lost, to serve, to give his life as a ransom. That was the purpose. And how did he do it? Well, did he come with some big social media marketing campaign? Did he come with let me just put up this really cool, sophisticated church building? I mean, whatever, name any other thing you want. Did he go to some ministry workshop with new evangelism tactics? I mean, the scriptures say Jesus came how? By eating and drinking. So much so, as we're going to see, that he's called a glutton. I just find that alarming. And I don't want us to tone that down. I mean, let's take the scriptures seriously. Jesus came eating and drinking. Yeah, his purpose was to come to seek and save the lost. But how did he do it? By eating and drinking. That was the means, the method to accomplishing his purpose. I mean, honestly, this might sound weird to say, but you could say Jesus was a party animal. I mean, Jesus' mission strategy was a long table with a loaf of bread, some fish, and a pitcher of wine. That is actually how Jesus did ministry. And so what I want us to see this morning, we're going to camp out in the Gospel of Luke. And we're going to see here in a couple seconds that Luke, which is one of the biographies of Jesus, Luke is just full of examples of Jesus eating and drinking. So let me give you a couple examples. Tim Chester outlines this. I'm just going to bullet point through these just so you can kind of get the feeling of this. In Luke chapter 5, which is what we're going to camp out here in a couple minutes, Jesus, he's eating with tax collectors and sinners at the home of Levi. Luke chapter 7, Jesus is anointed at the home of Simon the Pharisee during a meal. Luke chapter 9, Jesus feeds the 5,000. Luke chapter 10, Jesus eats in the home of Martha and Mary. Luke chapter 11, Jesus condemns the Pharisees and teachers of the law at a meal. Luke chapter 14, Jesus is at a meal when he urges people to invite the poor to their meals rather than their friends. My favorite, Luke chapter 19, Jesus invites himself to dinner with Zacchaeus. You ever know those people who just invite themselves over and you're like, dude, that's not etiquette? Well, Jesus did it. Luke chapter 22, the Last Supper, what we're going to celebrate this morning. I mean, think about this. We're so used to communion, but one of the most global symbols of Christianity is food and drink. Last thing, Luke chapter 24. The risen Christ, he has a meal with 2 disciples in Emmaus. And then he eats fish with his disciples in Jerusalem. Here's the whole point of this. Robert Karros, a New Testament scholar, he says this. In Luke's gospel, the whole story, Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal. And so this scholar, he writes a book about this and he titles it, Eating Your Way Through Luke's Gospel. I mean, that literally is what's going on here. Now, let me offer some clarity here. It isn't that Jesus is just kind of like this social butterfly and he, is just out to just eat and drink whenever and, he's just a party animal. I mean, we say that with humor, right? I mean, he was accused to be a glutton, but he wasn't actually a glutton. What's going on here? Here's what's going on. The meals that Jesus is eating and drinking at, that is his way to symbolically represent that he is opening up a new reality. And the new reality is this, that these meals represent the grace of God, the hope of God, the community, the salvation that Jesus brings. He says, hey, I'm going to make that evident in having a meal with you. What I love about Jesus is that he doesn't just talk kind of in abstract theoretical land. He actually makes things really palpable. And what he's demonstrating is by the food that you put in your mouth and by the drink that you drink. He said, hey, this symbolizes the utter grace of God. Jesus was the Messiah. They always knew that the Messiah would come and have this huge banquet feast, this huge celebration. And Jesus talks about that all the time, but he actually does it too. So this morning, I want us to leave with this thought. Jesus eating and drinking with others is a symbol of the grace of God. We're going to unpack that. Tim Chester says, Jesus' excess of food and his excess of grace are linked. His excess of food and his excess of grace are linked. So let's turn to Luke chapter 5, starting at verse 27. Here's where we will camp out this morning. This gets to the meat of it. And yes, I was waiting to make that pun. Luke chapter 5, verse 27. Here's our passage for this morning. After this, Jesus, he went out and he saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. Follow me, Jesus said to him. And Levi, he got up. He left everything and followed him. And then Levi, he held a great banquet for Jesus at his house. And a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus answered them, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." And they said to him, "John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours go on eating and drinking." The problem for the Pharisees here, the Pharisees are the religious Jewish leaders of the day. Their problem with Jesus is not that he's having a party. That wasn't the problem. As I said, when the Messiah came, they expected this Messiah to have this huge banquet feast. That wasn't the issue. The issue was who was on the guest list. They didn't like who Jesus was eating and drinking with. Tax collectors, some of us may know this, they were the social outcasts of the day in the first century. And some of this is obvious in that, people don't like having to pay taxes. And so they took your money, but it was kind of a double punch because tax collectors back then, they represented Rome. And Rome was the enemy of Israel. And so they were taking your money to give to your enemy, but here was the double punch. They then slapped an additional fee on it so that they could pocket some money. It was almost like you were getting double taxed. And I used to think, I preached this before, and a modern day metaphor would be like the IRS today. And the thing is, that's actually not true. We don't like the IRS. Does anybody here work for the IRS? Okay. I have a story to that. Anyways, so the funny thing is, well, no, it's not funny. Here's how shocking this would have been to them. It wasn't like what the IRS is for us today. It'd be like this. If Jesus was here today And we saw Jesus eating and drinking with like people from ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Or maybe another serious metaphor would be if he was eating with a pedophile. That is the shock of this. So we toned down the Bible. No. This was incredibly subversive and radical. This was not cool. Back in that culture, who you ate with was everything. The technical term for it is table fellowship. To give you some insight into this, here's what a New Testament scholar says. We'll put this up on the screens. It would be difficult to overestimate the importance of table fellowship for the culture of the Mediterranean basin in the first century of our era. Meal times were far more than occasion for individuals to consume nourishment. And here's the point. Being welcomed at a table for the purpose of eating food with another person had become a ceremony richly symbolic of friendship, intimacy, and unity. Thus, betrayal or unfaithfulness toward anyone with whom one had shared the table was viewed as particularly reprehensible. On the other hand, when people were estranged, a meal invitation opened the way to reconciliation. Essentially, all he's saying is this. Meals in the first century rule, the time of Jesus, meals were boundary markers. Who you ate with showed everyone else who you were friends with, who is in your tribe, who you were relationally connected to and kind of agreed with. You shared like lifestyles. So, we've heard the phrase that like you are what you eat. I think Jesus would flip that and say, no, actually, you are who you eat with. And I think the same thing is true for us today. Maybe not as obvious, but think of it this way. I would venture to guess that all of us in here probably eat and drink with people who are just like us. What do I mean? You probably spend the most amount of time eating and drinking with your family, right? People who biologically share the same blood and DNA as you. If you're in the business world, right, you probably eat and drink lunch, dinner with other business partners where there's shared financial mutual interest. I would think that you probably eat a lot with your friends, right, who probably live in the same area, roughly maybe the same income level, have the same passions, hobbies. Maybe you're eating with other, Laker fans, Angel fans, whatever. But most of us, by and large, we eat and drink with people who have a commonality with us in some capacity. Here's the question that I want us to end this series with. Do you eat and drink with your non-Christian neighbors? Do you eat and drink with your non-Christian neighbors? 2,000 years ago, it said a lot of who you eat with. It reveals your heart, and I think the same thing is true today. The crazy thing about this passage, if you haven't gotten it yet, is that Jesus ate with all the wrong people. He ate with everyone that he shouldn't have been. Tax collectors, other stories we learned that Jesus is hanging out and eating with prostitutes. Jesus is not doing this by accident. By eating and drinking with tax collectors, sinners, and prostitutes, his message is this: the grace of God is available for those who know that they need it. Jesus eating and drinking with others was a loud message that the grace of God is available to those who need it. Here's how Jesus' table fellowship compared to the religious people of his day. Jesus was radically welcoming while they were unwelcoming. Jesus was radically inclusive while the Pharisees and religious people were exclusive. Jesus' meals were full of joy, religious people full of grumbling. Jesus was feasting, They were fasting. Jesus was full of grace. They were full of religion. The Pharisees wanted Jesus to be a doctor. They had no problem with that. They just didn't want him to be a doctor to sick people. And Jesus is like, hey, I can only be a doctor if I'm hanging out and pursuing people who know that they need to be healed, who know that they're sick. Jesus is saying, that's who I want to hang out with. That's why I've come. Tim Chester writes this: God is indiscriminate. He chooses all the wrong sorts of people. He invites everyone to his great party. He invites the best, the worst, the highest, the lowest. He invites you. One person I read this week sums up the gospel as this: Jesus ate a lot of good food with a lot of bad people. That's real. Did you catch what the religious people say to Jesus at the end of verse 33? Here's what they say. And to me, this is like the dagger. John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees. But your disciples, Jesus, what do? They go on eating and drinking. Jesus' disciples go on eating and drinking. Brothers and sisters, if you are here this morning and you claim Christ, if we are disciples, if we are followers of Jesus, that same thing should be told of you and I. That we go on eating and drinking with those far from God. Jesus came to save the lost. And how did he do it? By eating and drinking. You can't lead someone to Jesus without getting to know them first. And I can't think of a better way to get to know someone than to share a meal with them. Here's an interesting question. How did Jesus win people over? Did he do it by yelling at them? Did Jesus stand on the corner with the sign that said, hey, you're going to hell? In any examples of Jesus doing that in the New Testament? The way Jesus pursued people was he said, hey, let's go to the table and let's talk. The modern day pulpit is the dining room table. The modern day pulpit is the dining room table. I think Jesus did so much of his ministry around the table and not from what we call a pulpit on a Sunday morning. So I venture to guess, and I think this has maybe been kind of the theme of this series, is that you may be thinking a couple things. Mark, too busy. Mark, I don't want anybody inside my house. And for this morning, maybe you're saying, Mark, I don't know how to cook. Here's the good news. Every single one of us in here, you're already eating and drinking probably 3 times a day. All we need to do is repurpose it for the kingdom of God. It's already something that you're doing. Everybody can do this. Last Sunday, we talked about hospitality. There's a lot of overlap here. Right? And we talked about, hey, we're not talking about entertainment, we're talking about hospitality. A lot of us think, oh, well, we got to be Martha Stewart, right? Got to have the matching dishware and the expensive china dishes out and all this kind of stuff. No, that's entertainment. That's not hospitality. That's nowhere in the scriptures either. I mean, for me, my wife's not right here. She's actually running a marathon this morning. But if she was here, you could ask her, There are two things that I rely upon for food: a microwave and a menu. Those are my pillars. I don't know how to cook. One of the great things about technology now is go YouTube a recipe, go Google something. If you don't want to spend time preparing a meal, go out. I'm going to disobey these statistics, but go out and have fast food. $5, $10, $15. It's not that expensive. Don't go somewhere fancy. If you don't want to spend time meal prepping, I think about the Mulders and Dan and their life group. Have a whole group do it. Share the responsibilities. Better yet, invite your neighbor. Have a potluck. Include them in the process. If you're a strong introvert and you're like, this is crazy, coffee, one-on-one. Don't be in a large group and skip all the superficial talk. For Rachel and I, my wife, we've tried to make this a core value of ours the last couple years. About this time last year, before we moved out here to Chino, we were in the Long Beach area, and it was the NBA finals were on. And I had learned that two of my neighbors, didn't really talk to them that much. I found out through a very casual conversation that they were huge basketball fans. And so I said, hey guys, why don't you come over and let's watch a game together. Put it on the big screen, 2-3 hours. Bring a beer over, we can have some chips and guacamole, and let's just talk and hang out and watch the game. Great. They came over. One of them, he had a 1-year-old daughter. She had just started walking, so she's walking all over our house. Parker was a week old or something, so he's crying. Rachel and I hadn't slept. We have a 12-pound Chihuahua that thinks she's 100 pounds and is incredibly moody and annoying and barks at strangers. The house is a mess. And we just sat on the couch and watched the basketball game, and I got to know them. One of them, early 20s, I learned that both of his parents had passed away. Had an incredibly rough upbringing. And we ended up just talking life over chips and guacamole, a basketball game. And you know what? A couple days later, I was outside in my front yard, and he walks up to me and says, hey, Mark, I got something for you. I got something to celebrate Parker's birth. I had no idea what he was going to give me. Went to his car, and he pulled out a cigar. And he said, I wanted to give this to you to celebrate your son's birth. And I don't bring that up to get into smoking. That's not my point. But what I realized at that moment as I walked back into my house is that he got something that was very common from his world as a symbol of appreciation to me. Why? Because I earned his trust. Because I had him come over and we just hung out and had fun and talked life. A couple weeks later from that different story, my previous church, there was a life group of us, actually very similar to what Mercy and Dan's life group is going to do. We threw a 4th of July neighborhood block party. So the whole group got together, and we went to someone's house. They lived in Bellflower, and everyone brought games and food and fireworks. The fireworks were legal. Someone brought just incredible pork belly, which was absolutely amazing. And 10 neighbors came over. Now here's what's interesting. One of these neighbors had been there for 19 years. Person right across from them, 9 years. They shook each other's hands and learned each other's names for the first time at this party. 19 years! And because we had a bunch of pork belly and some cheap legal fireworks, people began connecting. And some of those people ended up coming to church. There are so many examples, just to get practical, right? So Mercy Dan, their life group, the Larneds did the Memorial Day barbecue. There's a Labor Day coming up in a couple of weeks. Taco Tuesday, Wine Down Wednesday. There's so many things. A movie night, there's a sports game, whatever, NBA Finals. But how can we intentionally do a meal and invite people over or go to their house who we don't normally spend time with? And I'm not talking just to be Mr. Rogers and nice and warm and fuzzy, though that matters. But because there's something bigger going on here. Because by eating and drinking with someone, we can show and demonstrate the grace and love of Jesus Christ. Because we can actually listen to someone and care for them and ask them questions and let them know that we want to be involved in their life and just to bless them. And that it doesn't matter who you are, what you've done. The table's open for everyone. I was thinking, our culture today, right, iPhone culture, full of screen distractions. This might sound too simple or too ordinary, but I think one of the most Jesus-y things that we can do today is to sit across from someone, to put our phone down, and then fully engage them in a conversation and to listen to all their words and to ask them questions. I have never had someone turn me down for a meal that I pay for, and if they know I'm just going to listen to them and love on them. I'd be very, very hard-pressed to find someone say no to that. So I'm going to have the music team come back up this morning at this time. Before we transition to the table, 2 thoughts. One, I would just encourage you to ask the Holy Spirit, do you have a neighbor, and for some reason you have no neighbors that aren't Christians, coworker, family member, we get the point, that you could share a meal with? And the second thing is to do it. See, I think the way forward for the American church is actually the way backward to how Jesus did it, eating and drinking with those far from God. The modern day pulpit is the dining room table. The whole point of this whole Art of Neighboring series is so that we're the church out there and not just on a Sunday morning. We want the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God to invade your neighborhood. Jesus gives us, it's a command, let me be clear, but it's also an invitation to love your neighbor as yourself. There's no better way to love your neighbor than to start with coffee, a drink, burgers, whatever.